Welcome to Northvale Storyhouse. Here, every badge is tested, every lie is exposed, and every act of courage brings justice one step closer. If you believe the truth always deserves a voice, you're in the right place. Tell us where you're watching from, subscribe, and witness another unforgettable story. You can change a man's life in under a minute. If you're confident, he doesn't matter. The morning in downtown Chicago carried a cold stillness that made every sound feel sharper than usual, from distant sirens to the steady rhythm of footsteps on concrete sidewalks. As Officer Derek Collins stepped out of his patrol vehicle with the kind of certainty that came from years of never being questioned, his eyes scanning the street with practiced judgment, locking onto a man standing near the corner of Monroe Street who looked out of place only because he wasn't trying to look like he belonged anywhere special. Dressed in a simple dark jacket, plain shirt, and worn jeans, holding nothing but a phone in his hand as he observed the city with quiet attention. Derek's hand instinctively moved toward his radio, a suspicion formed without invitation, because in his mind, people either fit the picture of order or disruption, and this man did not fit the version he trusted. So with a firm step forward and a voice already carrying authority before a single fact was confirmed, he called out for the man to stop, the crowd nearby beginning to slow as curiosity replaced routine, phones subtly lifting as people sensed something unfolding. The man complied immediately, turning slowly with calm eyes that didn't match the tension forming around him. And when Derek approached, he didn't ask questions first. He studied posture, clothing, and silence the way he had been trained to interpret risk, dismissing anything that didn't align with his expectations, asking for identification in a tone that left no space for dialogue. The man reached calmly into his pocket and presented a simple ID card without resistance or hesitation, yet Derek barely looked at it, already convinced that the situation was clearer than it needed to be, because assumptions often feel like certainty when they go unchallenged. And without waiting for verification, he made a decision that shifted the entire atmosphere of the street, signaling for backup and instructing the man to remain where he was, the tone of command drawing a visible line between authority and compliance. As the man's expression remained steady, almost patient, like someone who had seen this moment before in a different form, a subtle glance passing over the growing crowd, as if measuring how quickly misunderstandings can become stories people believe. And when additional officers arrived within minutes, the situation tightened into procedural language and controlled movements. The man was asked again to confirm his identity, his answers consistent, calm, and unchanging, yet still met with caution rather than clarity, because certainty had already been chosen over curiosity. And in that space of controlled tension, a single phone call was placed, not hurried, not dramatic, just deliberate, as if it carried weight beyond the moment itself. And while Derek focused on maintaining order in what he believed was unfolding as a routine arrest, somewhere far beyond the street, a connection was being made that would not match his expectations of who stood quietly in front of him. A name spoken on the other end of the line would soon begin to shift the temperature of the entire situation, though for now, the only thing visible was a man standing still under gray morning light, surrounded by certainty that had not yet learned it was incomplete. The phone call traveled through the quiet tension of the street like a signal that no one fully understood yet, passing from dispatch to precinct channels with a calm urgency that contrasted sharply with the rigid focus surrounding the scene, while Officer Derek Collins maintained his attention on procedure rather than uncertainty, convinced that every step he had taken was aligned with protocol and experience. As the man he had detained remained composed, standing under the gray morning sky, with an expression that revealed nothing except patience and awareness. And as minutes passed, additional officers formed a loose perimeter that turned the sidewalk into a controlled space of observation rather than motion, with bystanders continuing to watch in silence, some recording, others simply trying to understand how a routine encounter had settled into something heavier than expected inside the system of communication. The first unusual detail appeared when a dispatcher paused mid-transmission after receiving a priority message from a city office line that carried a designation not commonly used for street-level incidents. The message requested immediate verification of an individual currently being held near Monroe Street, and included a name that caused a subtle shift in tone among those who heard it: Jonathan Pierce, a name that did not initially register as significant to everyone present, but carried an administrative weight that began to spread through the chain of communication as Derek stood nearby, still confident in his assessment, unaware that the conversation, now moving through radio channels, had expanded beyond standard identification checks. The man remained silent during this exchange, his gaze occasionally moving toward the distant skyline, as if unaffected by the growing attention, while one of the newer officers quietly suggested confirming records again, only to be met with a firm reminder that verification was already in progress. Moments later, the first crack in certainty appeared when the precinct supervisor requested immediate video confirmation from the scene, citing procedural caution due to the incoming information from City Hall. And as the request was acknowledged, Derek finally showed the first sign of hesitation, not in action, but an awareness that the situation was no longer contained within his original assumptions. The atmosphere shifted further when the radio crackled again with a direct instruction to pause any processing until identity confirmation was complete, a directive that introduced a level of seriousness that caused subtle exchanges between officers who had begun to sense that the name now attached to the individual on the sidewalk might not belong to someone ordinary. Inside the vehicle nearby, documents were cross-referenced, and within minutes, a second call arrived, this time from a senior administrative office, confirming that the individual in question held a position within city leadership, though the full designation was still being verified. And as those words reached the street-level officers, the visual perception of the situation began to change even if no one spoke it aloud. Derek looked again at the man, now noticing details he had previously dismissed: the calm posture, the absence of urgency, the steady patience that did not match the profile he had constructed earlier. And in that moment, the environment around them felt different, as if the air itself had shifted from certainty to uncertainty, while the phone in Derek's hand finally lit up with an incoming call that would determine whether the situation remained a routine misunderstanding or transformed into something far beyond what anyone on that sidewalk had prepared for. The phone in Officer Derek Collins' hand continued to ring with a steady insistence that cut through the controlled silence of the sidewalk, and when he finally answered, his posture shifted almost imperceptibly as he listened to a voice from the precinct that carried a tone he had never associated with a routine street stop. The instructions were clear but measured, requesting immediate confirmation of the individual currently detained and emphasizing that the situation had escalated beyond standard verification. As Derek responded with clipped professionalism, his eyes briefly returning to the man standing calmly a few feet away, still showing no sign of distress or urgency, while behind him the street remained filled with quiet observers who now sensed that something fundamental about the encounter was changing. The voice on the other end of the call provided additional details, referencing a direct inquiry from the city administration office and instructing that all actions pause until full identity confirmation was completed. And it was in that moment that the name Jonathan Pierce was repeated again, this time with greater clarity and weight, causing a subtle pause in Derek's breathing as he processed information that no longer aligned with his assumptions. Nearby officers exchanged brief looks, their earlier confidence replaced with a growing awareness that they were no longer dealing with a simple misunderstanding, but a situation that had entered official oversight channels. And as the call continued, another layer of information was delivered, stating that the individual in question was associated with the highest level of municipal leadership. Though the exact title was still being verified through secure records, the street seemed to grow quieter despite the presence of people, as if sound itself was being absorbed by the unfolding realization. Derek lowered his radio slightly, his focus now divided between procedure and perception, and for the first time he looked at the man not as a suspect, but as an unknown variable that did not fit any of the categories he had originally assigned. The man remained still, his expression unchanged, his calm presence now taking on a different meaning in the shifting context. And when the confirmation process reached its final stage, the precinct line went silent for a brief moment before the information was transmitted back down with unmistakable clarity, confirming that Jonathan Pierce was indeed the mayor of Chicago. And in that instant, the atmosphere on Monroe Street transformed completely, not through any movement or sound, but through the collective recognition that what had begun as a routine enforcement action had entered a reality far beyond its original frame. Derek stood motionless for a second that felt longer than it should have, his training still active but his certainty no longer intact, as the weight of the confirmation settled across the entire scene like an invisible reset of understanding. And around him the officers who had arrived as support now adjusted their stance subtly, not out of fear or panic, but out of procedural recalibration, while the bystanders who had been filming began to lower their phones slightly, sensing that the moment they were witnessing had shifted from confusion to consequence. And as Derek looked once more at the man he had detained, the realization formed fully that every assumption made in the previous minutes now existed in a different light, and the phone in his hand, once a tool of authority, now felt like the starting point of a chain of events that was no longer under his control. The confirmation from the precinct settled into the air around Monroe Street like a silent pressure that no one could ignore, and for Officer Derek Collins it arrived in a way that felt slower than sound, as if every second between hearing the words and understanding them stretched into something heavier than training could compress, while the man standing a few feet away remained still, his posture unchanged, his expression calm in a way that now carried undeniable meaning. And as the radio channels continued to carry updates that no longer matched the expectations of a routine field encounter, the officers present began to subtly adjust their positions, not out of alarm, but out of recognition that procedure had shifted into a different category entirely. Derek lowered his hand from his radio, his focus no longer on enforcement, but on comprehension, as the name Jonathan Pierce repeated again in his mind with the weight of official confirmation. And in that moment, the environment around him seemed to recalibrate, as if the street itself had acknowledged a correction to something that had been incorrectly defined only minutes earlier. The bystanders who had gathered continued to observe, their phones still raised, but now with less certainty about what they were witnessing, while the man who had been detained finally turned his head slightly, not toward Derek, but toward the direction of the incoming city vehicles that were now visible at the far end of the street, moving with a pace that suggested coordination rather than urgency. And as they approached, a shift in attention spread through the crowd, because the presence of unmarked city administration vehicles was not typical for routine street-level stops. When the first vehicle came to a controlled stop, a senior city representative stepped out and immediately surveyed the scene with focused attention, exchanging brief communication with officers already on site, and without raising his voice or creating disruption, he requested immediate confirmation of identity protocols be followed at once. Derek stood still as the interaction unfolded, his earlier certainty now replaced with a measured awareness that the situation was no longer defined by his initial judgment. The man at the center of it all remained composed, his hands relaxed, his gaze steady, and when the city representative finally addressed him directly with respectful acknowledgement, the tone of the entire scene shifted in a way that was visible even to those who did not fully understand the administrative weight behind the exchange. Confirmation was repeated again, not as speculation but as fact, and with it came a formal instruction that all enforcement actions were to be paused pending internal review. Derek felt the words land without force, but with unmistakable consequence, as if the structure he had been operating within had quietly begun to reorganize itself around a new reality. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, only procedural clarity replacing assumption, and as the man identified as Jonathan Pierce responded calmly to the city representative, his voice steady and controlled, it became clear that his presence in that moment carried authority that extended beyond the immediate interaction, reaching into systems that Derek had only ever engaged with indirectly. And in the quiet that followed, the officer realized that what had begun as a standard decision made in seconds had now expanded into an event being observed, recorded, and evaluated at multiple levels beyond the street itself. While the morning sun slowly broke through the clouds above Chicago, casting light over a scene that had fundamentally changed without a single act of force, only the arrival of truth that had corrected everything it touched. The presence of senior city officials on Monroe Street transformed the atmosphere into something far more structured than a simple street-level encounter, as every movement now followed procedural awareness rather than personal interpretation, and Officer Derek Collins stood slightly apart from the center of attention, no longer directing the situation but observing it unfold through a lens that had shifted from certainty to measured uncertainty, while Jonathan Pierce remained composed at the focal point of the interaction, his calm demeanor unchanged even as the context around him continued to evolve with official confirmations and administrative acknowledgments. And as additional communication arrived through secure channels, the tone of those conversations carried a level of priority that reinforced the reality of his position within the city's leadership structure, creating a clear divide between what had been assumed earlier and what was now being formally recognized. The senior representative on site maintained a steady presence, coordinating brief exchanges between departments while ensuring that every step aligned with established protocol. And within this controlled environment, the earlier classification of the situation as a routine enforcement action had been fully replaced by procedural review status, meaning that every decision made prior to confirmation would now be documented and evaluated through internal oversight channels. Derek listened as fragments of this process became visible through conversation and radio communication, each phrase reinforcing the fact that the situation had expanded beyond his direct authority, not through confrontation but through administrative structure. And as he stood there, the realization began to settle that his initial interpretation of events had been built entirely on incomplete information. While Jonathan Pierce finally spoke in a calm and steady voice, addressing the city representative with clarity rather than emotion, acknowledging the situation not as an escalation but as a correction of misunderstanding, a perspective that further shifted the tone of everyone present. Because there was no anger in his delivery, only controlled awareness of how quickly perception can replace accuracy when assumptions are left unchallenged. The surrounding officers remained professional, adjusting their stance to reflect the updated status of the situation, while bystanders continued to observe with a quiet sense of disbelief at how rapidly the identity of the individual at the center of the event had changed the meaning of everything that had occurred before. And as the city representative confirmed that a formal internal review would now be initiated to assess the sequence of actions taken, Derek felt a growing awareness that his role in the event was no longer about enforcement or decision-making, but about documentation and accountability within a larger system that now included him as part of its review. Jonathan Pierce offered no confrontation, only a brief acknowledgement of the process, before turning his attention toward the city officials coordinating the next steps. And in that moment, the street that had once been defined by suspicion and procedural certainty now existed in a state of administrative resolution, where every action was being reclassified through the lens of verified identity and institutional oversight, leaving Officer Derek Collins standing in a silence that carried more weight than any command he had issued earlier that morning, as the realization settled that what had begun as a routine judgment had now become a recorded sequence of events that would move far beyond the sidewalk where it started. The situation on Monroe Street had fully transitioned into a structured administrative response, where every movement was now guided by protocol rather than interpretation, and Officer Derek Collins remained positioned slightly behind the primary exchange, no longer driving the direction of events, but absorbing each procedural update as it passed through official channels. While Jonathan Pierce stood at the center of attention with a calm presence that did not shift despite the growing formality around him, and as additional city personnel arrived to support the coordination effort, the environment became increasingly defined by documentation, verification, and controlled communication rather than uncertainty or speculation. Every officer on site now understood that the encounter had moved beyond the scope of a routine field stop and into a formal review process initiated at the city level, and this realization quietly changed the way each person carried themselves, including Derek, who now observed the interaction with a sense of delayed awareness that every assumption made earlier had been based on incomplete context, as the senior city representative confirmed once again that Jonathan Pierce's identity had been fully verified through secure municipal records, and that all actions taken prior to confirmation would be logged for internal assessment. The tone of the exchange remained steady and professional, with no escalation or emotional reaction, only the steady unfolding of procedural clarity. And as Jonathan listened to the confirmation with composed attention, he responded with brief acknowledgement that reflected understanding rather than conflict. reinforcing the shift in atmosphere from enforcement to administrative resolution. Nearby bystanders continued to observe in silence, their earlier curiosity now replaced with a more reflective awareness of how quickly perception can influence action in moments of uncertainty. While communication between precinct leadership and city administration continued in the background, ensuring that every step taken from the initial stop to the current status was properly recorded within official systems. Derek remained still as he processed the sequence of events, recognizing that his role had transitioned from decision-making to participation in a documented review process that would examine timing, judgment, and procedural accuracy. And as the senior representative concluded the on-site coordination by confirming that further instructions would be issued through formal channels only, the street returned to a quieter state. Not because the situation had ended abruptly, but because it had been absorbed into a structured framework of accountability, leaving behind a clear record of how quickly certainty can change when verified information replaces assumption. And as Jonathan Pierce prepared to leave under official escort, the final impression left on those present was not one of confrontation or conflict, but of a system correcting itself through process. While Officer Derek Collins remained in place for several moments longer, standing in silence that reflected the weight of realization that what had unfolded was no longer about a single decision, but about the consequences of interpretation within a system built on precision and verification. As the final stage of the coordination process unfolded on Monroe Street, the presence of city officials and internal oversight representatives had already transformed the encounter into a fully documented administrative event, and Officer Derek Collins remained in place as a participant within that system rather than its operator, listening as final procedural confirmations were exchanged through secure communication channels that now carried the outcome of verification rather than uncertainty. While Jonathan Pierce stood at a respectful distance from the center of activity, his calm presence unchanged even as the structure around him completed its transition from field response to formal review closure, and the surrounding officers maintained professional composure as instructions were relayed to finalize reports, ensure accuracy of timestamps, and secure all recorded material related to the initial stop, creating a complete record of events that would be reviewed through internal standards rather than immediate judgment. Derek observed these steps with a quiet awareness that every detail he had once interpreted in isolation now existed within a larger framework that prioritized verification over assumption. And as the city representative confirmed that all procedural requirements had been satisfied and that the matter would proceed solely through administrative channels, the tension that had defined the earlier moments of the encounter finally began to dissolve into structured resolution, not through confrontation or escalation, but through the completion of formal process. Jonathan offered a brief acknowledgement to the officials present before turning away with measured calm, accompanied by city personnel who ensured that all protocols were observed without disruption, while bystanders slowly began to disperse, their attention fading as the significance of what they had witnessed settled into reflection rather than reaction. And in the quiet that followed, the street returned to its ordinary rhythm, vehicles resuming movement and distant city sounds reclaiming the space that had briefly been defined by procedural intensity. Derek remained still for several moments longer, his focus no longer on the unfolding scene, but on the internal realization that the foundation of every decision made earlier had depended entirely on incomplete information. And as he finally lowered his gaze and prepared to return to standard duty procedures, the weight of the experience remained not as conflict, but as consequence within a system designed to correct itself through verification, leaving behind a clear reminder that authority, without complete understanding, can only exist temporarily before being reshaped by truth. The street on Monroe Street had returned to its natural rhythm. Yet for those who had been present, the silence left behind carried a different weight, the kind that lingers even after the visible tension has already dissolved. And Officer Derek Collins stood near his patrol vehicle with a stillness that contrasted sharply with the earlier decisiveness of his actions, his attention no longer focused on procedure or enforcement, but on the sequence of events that had unfolded in a way he could now only observe in reverse, as if every decision he had made earlier that morning had been reconstructed under a different understanding of context. while nearby officers gradually dispersed to resume standard duty assignments, their radios returning to routine communication patterns that no longer reference the incident except in formal notation and in the distance. City personnel ensured that all documentation was secured and properly logged into the official system, marking the conclusion of on-site coordination. Jonathan Pierce had already departed under structured escort, his presence leaving behind not disruption, but a trace of administrative gravity that continued to shape how the remaining officers processed what had occurred. And as Derek remained in place, he found himself recalling each moment with increasing clarity, not as isolated actions, but as part of a sequence that had shifted meaning once verified identity entered the equation. The calm demeanor, the consistent responses, the absence of urgency that had once seemed unremarkable now appeared differently when viewed through the lens of confirmed authority. And yet there was no confrontation left to analyze, only process, only record, only review, as internal systems had already begun compiling reports that would be evaluated at a higher administrative level. The city's oversight structure ensuring that every detail from the initial stop to the final confirmation was preserved in full procedural context. And in that realization, Derek felt a quiet awareness settle in, not of consequence in a personal sense, but of how interpretation itself functions within structured environments, how quickly certainty can form, and how equally quickly it can be replaced when new information arrives through verified channels. Around him, the city continued without pause. Vehicles moving through intersections, pedestrians continuing their day with little awareness of the internal recalibration that had just taken place within the system. And as Derek finally turned toward his vehicle, he understood that the incident would no longer exist in the space of immediate action, but would instead continue in another form, within reports, reviews, and procedural assessments that would examine every step with precision, not to assign blame in isolation, but to understand sequence and decision under incomplete information. And as he entered his vehicle and prepared to leave the location, the final impression left in his mind was not of disruption or conflict, but of correction, a reminder that in systems built on verification, every assumption is temporary, and every certainty is subject to revision when truth arrives through official confirmation rather than expectation. Later that afternoon in downtown Chicago, the city had already resumed its normal rhythm. Yet for Officer Derek Collins, the events of the morning continued to unfold internally as a sequence he could no longer separate from analysis. As he sat inside his patrol vehicle parked along a quiet side street and reviewed the preliminary digital report displayed on his terminal, every entry timestamped, every action documented, every communication recorded with procedural clarity that left no room for interpretation outside of official context. And as he read through the structured summary of the Monroe Street incident, he noticed how the language had shifted from field perception to administrative neutrality, replacing judgment with sequence and replacing assumption with verification. While the name Jonathan Pierce appeared repeatedly throughout the document, now accompanied by full confirmation of identity and position within city leadership. And as Derek continued scanning the report, he paused at sections detailing the exact timing of the verification call, the arrival of city representatives, and the formal instruction to halt enforcement actions pending confirmation, each line reinforcing the distance between perception in the moment and truth established afterward. Outside his vehicle, pedestrians moved through the sidewalks with routine indifference, unaware of the internal procedural documentation being compiled in real time across multiple departments, while inside the system the event had already been categorized for internal review, not as misconduct, but as a sequence requiring evaluation of situational judgment under incomplete data. Derek leaned back slightly in his seat, his hands resting near the steering wheel as he processed the fact that every decision he had made that morning had been consistent with training, yet still subject to reinterpretation under verified context. And in that realization, there was no frustration, only a structured awareness of how rapidly certainty can form in environments where information is incomplete, and how equally rapidly it can dissolve when confirmation arrives through official channels. As he closed the report interface and prepared to return to active duty, the city around him continued unchanged, traffic signals cycling through their patterns, vehicles passing through intersections, and life continuing without interruption, while internally the system he served continued to refine and document the event with precision, ensuring that every detail from initial contact to final verification was preserved for review. And as Derek started the vehicle and rejoined the flow of traffic, the morning no longer felt like a singular moment of decision, but rather like a recorded example of how interpretation, procedure, and truth interact within a structured system designed to correct itself through verification over time. By the time Officer Derek Collins re-entered active duty rotation later that afternoon, the city had already moved forward as if the morning incident had been absorbed into its larger operational memory. Yet within him the sequence of events remained active, replayed through structured thought rather than emotion. As he drove through downtown Chicago with the windows slightly lowered and the sound of the city filtering into the vehicle in a steady rhythm of traffic signals, distant construction, and passing conversations that belonged to a world that had not paused for what had occurred earlier. And as he approached the intersection near Monroe Street once again during routine patrol routing, he noticed how ordinary everything looked in contrast to the complexity that had unfolded there only hours before. Pedestrians crossing without awareness, delivery vehicles stopping briefly before continuing on, and the same stretch of sidewalk now empty of any visible trace of the administrative presence that had defined the earlier resolution. Yet internally, the documentation of the incident continued to expand within official systems, as internal review departments began compiling standardized summaries based on verified timelines, recorded communications, and procedural checkpoints. And Derek, though no longer directly involved in that process, understood that his actions would be evaluated not in isolation but within the broader framework of decision-making under uncertainty, a framework that existed precisely to distinguish between error and interpretation when information is incomplete. As he parked briefly along a side street and opened the updated report feed on his device, scrolling through refined entries that now included synchronized timestamps from dispatch, city administration confirmation logs, and supervisory annotations, each line reinforcing the structured nature of how the system processes events after the fact. And in that quiet moment, he reflected not on what had gone wrong, because nothing in the report indicated wrongdoing, but on how quickly perception can construct certainty when no verification is yet present, and how that certainty can feel absolute in the moment even when it is built on partial visibility. While outside, his vehicle life continued without pause, a reminder that every structured system exists within a larger environment that never stops moving forward. And as he closed the report and prepared to resume patrol, he carried with him a clearer understanding that within his profession, truth is not defined by the first conclusion reached, but by the final confirmation recorded after every layer of information has been fully aligned. Later that evening, the internal review process connected to the Monroe Street incident had already progressed beyond field documentation and into structured administrative evaluation, where Officer Derek Collins' actions were no longer viewed through the immediacy of the moment, but through a sequential reconstruction of verified data. And within the Chicago Police Department review system, his case file appeared alongside standardized categories that focused on procedural alignment, timing, accuracy, and communication integrity, while Derek himself was off-duty and seated in a quiet residential setting away from the noise of the city. His attention fixed on a departmental notification displayed on his device, confirming that a preliminary review had been completed and that all actions taken during the encounter had been logged under standard operational conditions pending final administrative assessment. And as he read through the summarized findings, he noticed how the language used by the system was deliberately neutral, removing emotional interpretation and replacing it with structured phrasing that emphasized sequence, verification, and procedural compliance. While across the city, the same event had already begun to fade from public attention, replaced by new developments and daily activity. Yet within the administrative framework, it continued to exist as a complete dataset being analyzed for consistency and training evaluation purposes, and Derek leaned back slightly, recognizing that his involvement in the incident would now be preserved not as a moment of conflict, but as an example of decision-making under incomplete information, a concept repeatedly referenced in internal policy guidelines designed to improve situational assessment in future field operations. And as he reflected on this, he understood that the system he worked within did not define outcomes based on initial perception, but on the full reconstruction of verified context, where every decision is re-examined once additional data becomes available. And although the experience from earlier that day still lingered in his memory, it was now framed differently, no longer as uncertainty or consequence, but as part of a structured learning process embedded within the organization itself. While outside his window, the city continued its normal rhythm with evening traffic, distant sirens, and the steady movement of daily life, unaffected by the internal administrative processes that had already recorded, analyzed, and categorized the events of the morning, leaving Derek with a quiet understanding that within systems built on verification, no single moment stands alone, and every action ultimately becomes part of a larger record shaped not by assumption, but by confirmed truth over time. The following morning in Chicago, the city had already moved forward with its usual rhythm. Yet within the Chicago Police Department, the administrative life cycle of the Monroe Street incident continued in a structured and finalized form, where Officer Derek Collins' case had transitioned from active review into formal documentation storage. And within the internal system, the file was now categorized as a completed procedural evaluation pending periodic audit, with all timestamps, communications, and supervisory annotations preserved in a standardized format designed to support long-term training analysis. While Derek himself sat in a quiet briefing room preparing for the start of his next assigned shift, his attention briefly drawn to a departmental update notice confirming that no procedural violations had been identified during preliminary review, and that the case would remain part of internal training material focused on situational judgment under incomplete information. And as he read these words, he recognized the shift in perspective that had occurred since the previous day, where what had once felt like a single high-intensity encounter was now reduced to structured data points within a broader operational framework. And although the memory of the moment remained clear, its meaning had been reframed through the language of verification, process, and institutional learning. Across the city, life continued, uninterrupted, with no visible reminder of the administrative sequence that had unfolded behind the scenes. And as Derek closed the notification and prepared his equipment for patrol, he reflected quietly on how every decision within his profession exists within two parallel realities, one experienced in real time and one reconstructed through verified information. And in that understanding, he acknowledged that within a system built on documentation and confirmation, truth is not defined by the immediacy of perception, but by the completeness of the record that remains after every detail has been reviewed and aligned. Several days later, the official administrative cycle connected to the Monroe Street incident had reached its final closure stage within the Chicago Police Department record system, where Officer Derek Collins' involvement was now fully archived under completed case documentation, and the system displayed the final status update indicating that all procedural reviews had been concluded, all supervisory evaluations had been finalized, and all related communications had been verified against recorded dispatch logs. While Derek himself sat in a quiet moment of reflection inside the precinct briefing area before the start of his assigned shift, holding the printed summary of the final administrative closure notice, which confirmed that the case had been formally categorized as a verified identity resolution incident with no disciplinary action required. And as he read through the standardized language used in the document, he noticed how every reference to uncertainty, perception, and field interpretation had been replaced with structured phrasing emphasizing confirmation, alignment, and procedural accuracy. And in that moment, he understood that the entire sequence of events had been fully absorbed into the institutional memory of the department, not as a moment of conflict, but as a completed example of how information evolves through verification layers within a structured system. Across the city, the day continued with normal activity. Traffic moving steadily through intersections, pedestrians passing through downtown streets, and routine patrol assignments being distributed without reference to the earlier event. Yet within the internal framework of the department, the incident remained preserved as part of long-term training material designed to reinforce the importance of confirmation before conclusion. And as Derek folded the document and prepared to begin his shift, he reflected quietly on the nature of professional judgment within systems built on data integrity, recognizing that every action taken in the field exists simultaneously in two forms, one experienced in the immediacy of the moment and one reconstructed later through verified information. And in that understanding, he carried forward a calm awareness that within such systems, truth is not determined by the speed of perception, but by the completeness of confirmation that ultimately defines the final record.